Hello and welcome to cEDH Portuguese League. Today, we bring you a gameplay from the third round of our last tournament, Quest for the Cradle. Before we start, a shout out to our patrons for helping us bring you more content and better tournaments. If you want to help us grow even more, you can become our patron by clicking on the link in the description below and leaving a like and subscribe. Also, we want to give a special thanks to our community for helping us reach the 500 subscribers. Now, to the game. Pedro is playing a Rhoda Timin, a heavy stacks deck that takes advantage of multiple stacks pieces to prevent its opponents from winning, while pumping Rhoda to one-shot its opponents one at a time. Tiago piloting Winota, a snowball stacks deck that seeks to play non-human creature before landing its commander to cheat a lot more into play at an alarming rate, forcing its opponents to be aware at all time. Late playing Tasigur the Golden Fang, a control deck that seeks to slow down its opponents with a lot of interaction pieces until it's safe enough to finally land a win con at the table. And last but not least, we have Jeff playing Lonis, Cryptozoologist. This is a mid-range deck that seeks to land an infinite ETB combo while taking advantage of its commander's ability as an enabler to a Thoracle line. Pedro Mulligan once and kept a starting hand with a Glacial Fortress, a Mana Crypt for early ramp, a Force of Will's interaction, a Steel Shaper's Gift to tutor out for some stacks pieces, a Trinius Sphere, and a Resting Piece to slow down its opponents, and a Supreme Verdict. Tiago Mulligan twice, and kept an opening hand with a Flooded Strand and a Plains for lands, Chrome Mox for early ramp, a Vryn Wingmare and a Evermind Sensor to slow down its opponents, and a Red Elemental Blaster interaction. Late also Mulliganed once, and kept a starting hand with an Underground Sea, a Gemstone Caverns and a Wooded Foothills for lands, a Talisman of Domination and a Dark Ritual for early ramp, a Delay and a Chain of Vapors for interaction. Jeff Mulligan twice, and kept a starting hand with a Verdant Catacombs and a Flooded Strand for lands, an Allosaurus Shepherd, a Green Sun Zenith to fetch for a combo piece, a Gila Drake and an Earthcraft. Late won the die roll and is starting first. Let the third round begin. Late draws, and starts the game off playing a Wooded Foothills and passing. Jeff moves to his turn. On his main phase, he plays a Verdant Catacombs and takes 1 damage to fetch for a forest. He plays an Allosaurus Shepherd and passes. Pedro draws. He plays a Glacial Fortress, he follows it with a Mana Crypt and also passes. Tiago plays a Flooded Strand, following it with a Chrome Mox pitching a Vryn Wingmare. He takes 1 damage to fetch for a Plateau and still plays a Thorn of Amethyst before passing. On his end step, Late takes 1 damage to fetch for a Breeding Pool to the battlefield tapped and moves to his turn. He draws. On his main phase, he plays an Underground Sea and follows it with a Dark Ritual to play a Dothi Voidwalk. No one answers it and Late passes. Jeff begins his turn playing a Flooded Strand. He takes some damage to fetch for an island and plays Lonis. Due to the Allosaurus Shepherd's ability, his commander resolves and Jeff ends the turn. On Pedro's upkeep, he rolls a die and escapes the crypt damage. On his main phase, he plays a Mystic Gate, takes a moment to ponder and ends up playing his commander Rhoda and passing. Tiago draws. On his main phase, he simply plays a Plains and ships the turn. Late begins his turn playing a Mana Confluence. He follows it with a Mox Diamond discarding a Gemstone Caverns. He proceeds to play his commander Tasigur and moves to combat sending Dothi at Tiago for 3 damage, and after damage resolves, Late passes. Jeff moves to his turn. On his main phase, he plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He attempts to play an Earthcraft, and it resolves. Jeff activates Earthcraft's ability 2 times, triggering Rhoda's ability to play Gila Drake, which resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Jeff activates the Earthcraft 1 more time, triggering Rhoda again, and switches the Gila Drake for Tasigur. Jeff then ends his turn. At the beginning of Pedro's upkeep, the Crypt triggers, but once again he escapes the damage. He draws. He plays an island, and takes a moment. He decides to play Steel Shaper's Gift, which Tiago immediately responds with an Evermind Sensor. Jeff responds to the Evermind Sensor playing a Worldly Tutor triggering Rhoda to fetch for a Shrieking Drake. The Evermind Sensor then resolves, and unfortunately for Pedro, he fails to find a card on the top 4. Pedro moves to combat sending Rhoda at Jeff for 7 damage, he takes it, and Pedro ends the turn. Tiago draws. He plays a Sacred Foundry tapped, and follows it with a Ginger Brute. Then he moves to combat sending the Evermind Sensor at Jeff for 2 damage, afterwards he passes. Late moves to his turn. On his main phase, he plays a Soul Ring, and then moves to combat sending both the Gila Drake and Dothi Voidwalker at Jeff for 6 damage. With that, Late ships a turn. Jeff draws. He tries to create an opening playing a Green Sun Zenith, X being 2, triggering Rhoda, but none of its opponents fall for the bluff and let it resolve. Jeff searches the top 4 cards but fails to find a creature due to the Evermind Sensor. Since no one fell for the bluff, he decides to pass. Pedro goes to his turn. On his upkeep, the Crypt triggers and once again he still doesn't take the damage. On his main phase, he plays an Exotic Orchard. He takes a moment and decides to play a Trinisphere, stopping Jeff from creating an infinite loop. Pedro moves to combat, sending once again his commander at Jeff, this time for 8 damage. He takes it and he ends the turn. Tiago draws. He plays a Battlefield Forge, following it with its commander Winota, and moves to combat, sending the Aven Mind Sensor at Jeff and the Ginger Brute at late, triggering Winota. The first trigger, he puts a Mog Catcher into play, attacking late. The second trigger, he puts a Blade Historian attacking Jeff. After damage resolution, late ends up taking 6 damage and Jeff takes 8. With that, Tiago passes. Late moves to his turn. He plays a Talisman of Domination and passes to Jeff. On his turn, he plays a Shrieking Drake, triggering Lonis to create a clue and targeting itself to bounce. But before it resolves, he activates Earthcraft's ability to untap a land, also triggering Rhoda, and bounces back to his hand. Since he's already the biggest target at the table, Jeff passes. Pedro moves to his turn. On his upkeep, he rolls a die and escapes again from the crit damage. On his main phase, he plays an Arid Mesa and cracks it, forgetting about the Aven Mind Sensor, and fails to find a land on the top 4. He moves to combat, sending his commander Rhoda at Tiago for 9 damage to maybe force him to block with Winota, but Tiago ends up taking the damage. On his second main phase, Pedro plays a Supreme Verdict. In response, Jeff sacrifices his clue to maybe draw an answer, but no luck. He still untaps 2 lands and the Supreme Verdict resolves, exiling everything. Feeling good with his play, Pedro passes. Tiago draws. He decides to play safe and passes, saving mana in case of some interaction is needed. Late moves to his turn, and on his main phase he takes some time to think on what to do and ends up playing a Culling Ritual. No one responds. Late adds 3 green mana and 4 black mana to his mana pool. He plays his commander for the second time. He follows it with a Birding Pod. Afterwards, he sacrifices Tasigur to the Birding Pod, losing 2 life, to fetch for a Coma to the battlefield. On his end step, Tiago tries to play Red Elemental Blast on Coma, but Late responds immediately with a delay. The Red Elemental Blast is countered and exiled with 3 suspend counters on it. Late passes. Jeff moves to his turn. On his upkeep, the Coma triggers, but he answers it with a Submerge, putting it on the top of Late's deck. The trigger resolves and Jeff draws. Since he stepped out, Jeff passes to Pedro. He moves to his turn. On his main phase, he simply plays an Archon of Emeria and ends his turn. On Tiago's upkeep, he removes the suspend counter from the Red Elemental Blast. On his main phase, he plays an Arid Mesa. He follows it with a Combat Celebrant. He takes 1 damage to fetch for the planes, and passes, saving mana just in case. Late moves to his turn. He moves straight to combat, sending the Coma's Coil at Jeff for 3 damage. On his second main phase, he activates the Burning Pod, sacrificing Coma's Coil to fetch for the Deathrite Shaman, and passes. Jeff, on his main phase, plays a Nature's Claim targeting Late's Burning Pod, destroying it this way, and passes the turn to Pedro. He draws. He moves straight to combat, setting the Archon of Emeria at late for 2 damage. It resolves, and Pedro decides to pass, saving mana just in case. Tiago, on his upkeep, removes another suspend counter from the Red Elemental Blast. He draws. On his main phase, he dashes a Ragavan into play and moves to combat, sending it at Pedro for 2 damage. After damage, the Ragavan triggers. Pedro exiles the City of Brass and Tiago creates a treasure. Tiago decides to end the turn, but on his end step, the Ragavan goes back to his hand. Late draws. He decides not to play anything and just passes. Jeff moves to his turn. On his main phase, he plays a Preordain. He puts a Misty Rainforest on the battlefield tapped due to Archons of Emeria's ability and ends the turn. Pedro draws. He moves straight to combat, sending the Archon at late for 2 damage and also passes. At the beginning of Tiago's upkeep, the last suspend counter is removed from the Red Elemental Blast, targeting his Combat Celebrant since there isn't a better target. On his main phase, he plays a Mountain, and once again dashes a Ragavan. He moves to combat, sending it at Pedro for 2 damage, and after damage resolution, Pedro reveals an Esper Sentinel and Tiago creates another treasure. On his second main phase, he plays the Esper Sentinel and passes, bouncing back the Ragavan. On his end step, Late activates Deathrite Shaman to exile the Red Elemental Blast, and each opponent loses 2 life. Late once again skips his turn, leaving mana open. Jeff draws. He takes 1 damage to fetch for an island to play Scrib Ranger, activating it right away to play the same forest. Pedro moves to his turn. He plays a snow-covered plains and moves to combat, sending once again Archon of Emeria at late for 2 damage before passing. Tiago on his turn dashes once more the Ragavan and moves to combat, sending everything at Pedro for 7 damage, exerting the Combat Celebrant to have another combat phase. After damage, Pedro reveals a Talisman of Progress and Tiago creates a treasure. On his second combat phase, Tiago sends everything again at Pedro for 7 damage, exerting the Combat Celebrant once more. Pedro reveals a Cursed Totem and Tiago creates yet another treasure. On Tiago's third combat phase, he sends once more everything at Pedro for 7 damage, making him reveal a Sea of Clouds from the top, and Tiago creates again another treasure. Due to a misinterpretation of the Combat Celebrant, Tiago repeated the exert trigger one more time. Since everyone at the table agreed to Tiago's explanation, no judge was called to the table to explain the ruling. On his second main phase, he played the Draenei's Magistrate, but the table immediately reminded him about the Archon of Emiria's ability, so he puts the Draenei's back on his hand and passes. On his end step, the Ragavan bounces back to Tiago's hand. Late, for the third time this game, decides yet again not to play anything and save mana for some possible interaction. Jeff draws. On his main phase, he plays a Forest. After some consideration, he plays Lonis again and passes. Pedro, on his turn, simply plays a Mana Vault and chips a turn. Tiago draws. He plays a Plains and dashes Ragavan once again and moves to combat, this time sending only Ragavan at late for 2 damage. But this time he was prepared. He played the Cyclonic Rift, bouncing the Ragavan, paying for the Sentinel's trigger. With that, Tiago passes. Late, on his turn, plays a Thassa's Oracle, and since he doesn't have much more to do, he plays an Overgrown Tomb and moves the turn to Jeff. He only plays a Tropical Island, and decides to play safe, passing with mana open. Pedro draws. He plays a Gilded Drake, resolves, and he switches it with a Combat Celebrant, thinking about taking some advantage of its ability. He moves to combat once more, sending the Archon of Emiria at late for 2 damage and passing afterwards. Tiago moves to his turn. On his main phase, he plays his commander Winota, to which Jeff immediately responds with a Pact of Negation, countering it this way. Tiago then moves to combat, sending the Gilded Drake at late for 3 damage. He takes it and Tiago passes. Late gets to his turn, and once more he decides to untap and pass the turn. Jeff moves to his turn. On his upkeep, he pays for the Pact of Negation played earlier, and he activates the Script Ranger to bounce the Forest to his hand. He plays it before passing. Pedro draws. He plays a Mana Confluence. He follows it with his second commander Timin, Youthful Geist. No one responds and he moves to combat. At the beginning of the combat phase, he taps the Esper Sentinel and attacks Tiago with everything for 6 damage, exerting the Combat Celebrant. On his second combat phase, he sends the Archon once more at Tiago for 2 damage before passing. Tiago on his turn plays his commander Winota yet again and moves to combat. At the beginning of his combat phase, Timin triggers, and Pedro taps the Gilded Drake, stopping Tiago from triggering Winota. With that, Tiago ships the turn. Late draws. He begins his turn playing a Bayou. The judge announces the end of the round, so Late decided to show some sportsmanship by passing the turn and ending the game in a tie. Despite the third round ended up in a draw, we were able to see how strong Stacks decks can be in cEDH. After the third round, this is what our standings look like. Next week, we'll have the fourth round of our tournament featuring Gonçalo playing Tasigur, Agostinho playing Nimris, Adriel playing Ishai Jeska, and SplitSecond Late playing Tasigur. This will be the last match that decides who the top 16 players are, so don't miss out. As always, if you like our content and would like to see more, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can always become a patron for early access to our videos and other rewards. Thank you very much, see you in the next one. We would like to thank the SplitSecond for the partnership, the Monarch team for providing us with a Squire bot to help us run our tournaments, and the Renat Vir for providing us the place.